Well, here we are. Thanks, everyone. This is me chatting while folks come into the room. My name's Lillian Brislin. I'm coming to you live from the beautiful, if frigid, state of Colorado. If you all, while you're coming in, would like to add in the chat who you are, where you're coming from, what your role is in this vast and wonderful and weird food system that we are all sharing interest in. And we've got a great number of folks here today. So again, Lillian Brislin with Colorado State University. I'm going to introduce our webinar today and our panelists, and we will get going. Thank you. Washington State, love it. Cornell. Where's my folks in the middle? Yes, Pennsylvania. All right. Oh, with the food bank, great. So we always have an amazing array of people that come to this conversation, which I think is what makes us love food systems so much, is the different perspectives and contexts and passions that we bring to the work. And today, if you happen to be a data dork, boy, are you in luck, because this is all data all day. So with this webinar series is part of a cooperative agreement project with USDA AMS, with Colorado State University and University of Kentucky, that has extended from a project that started in the beginning of the pandemic, looking at COVID's impact on local food systems, local and regional food systems, and has since evolved to look at this process of recovery and then addressing underlying structural and top of mind conditions for fostering equitable and just approaches to resilience. The webinar series is our way of sharing our internal conversations and processes. Like, we shouldn't get to keep all the cool, fun conversations to ourselves on the project team. So we want to share those with you all as our stakeholders, so that you can learn alongside us. We have a number of NGO, community-based organization partners who work directly with stakeholders in local and regional food systems. You can view them and learn more information about past project work on our website. And then maybe that's all I want to say about that. So today's topic is coming out of one of our what we call our 2.0 of the project, our focus on understanding needs and opportunities related to data and metrics for the local and regional food system sector as a whole. So that cross-sectoral piece, not just farmers markets, not just niche meats, but all of these places that they intersect. And can you go to the next slide, I think? Sorry. Great, and that is happening in addition to two other pieces of our work. One, resilience playbook, which I lead with my colleague Annalise Straw, asking questions of how do we take the lessons that we were hard won during the pandemic, when we were all navigating the pandemic together, and carry those forward so that we stay ready for the next disruption, because we know they will happen, be they public health or climate or other forms. And then our network of networks, which is a way to, in that spirit of staying ready, creating a robust collaborative network of food systems network leaders, so we can learn and share and engage in collaborative problem solving and goal seeking together. Thanks, Libby. So to give a deeper dive into what data metrics is doing, I will turn it to my colleague, Libby Christensen, who's going to give us the rundown and a little more on what that team's working on.
Good morning, everybody. So happy to have you here. And this webinar is really an opportunity for the data and metrics to share, kind of, as Lillian said, the process that we're going through right now. The goal of the project is to ensure that different stakeholders, be they academic, practitioners, or policymakers, have access to a more comprehensive selection of data on local and regional food systems, as well as different tools to support rapid adoption of innovation metrics for efficient planning and evaluation to support these future disruptions that Lillian was talking about, and really trying to figure out how we can spur or catalyze opportunities. So we've seen this as the strategy that we're moving forward with is a two-part approach. The first one is going to focus on creating a data warehouse where we're able to bring together data from all different types of sources, be they secondary federal sources that are already collected, but also looking at our community stakeholders and partners to get a better sense of what data they're already collecting and be able to bring that to one centralized location and really create a community of practice of utilizing and analyzing and visualizing that information in new and innovative ways. And so we're working right now to create that warehouse for that information to go. So it's essentially a space to put that information and then share across platforms, across sectors. But at the other piece that we're thinking about is what tools would be helpful for folks on the ground to be able to better tell the stories and communicate the impacts that they're having in their communities rapidly to a wide array of audiences, and really look at those cross-sector opportunities. So many of the things that we have really focus in on our one particular area of expertise, but one of the amazing things about food systems is the impact and the reach is so broad. And so how are we more effective in telling that story? So we're going to hear from a couple of folks today to find out how they're going through that process at different stages of their growth and development. And then we're going to really pose the question to you about what would be useful for you to be able to better tell your story or your impact moving forward. But before we dive too deep into those questions and hearing from our panelists, we're going to turn it over to Brett and Jairus. Brett and Jairus, who are two other colleagues on this project, have been interviewing communities of practice and stakeholders and finding out how they're currently using data and some of the challenges that they have with that. So I'll let
awesome.
Brett screen.
Well, I drew the short straw, so you'll be hearing from me. I'm going to just drop my 3 points. I just have 3 points in the chat there, so you can follow along with me. My name is Brett Wolf. I work at the University of Kentucky, and with Jairus Rossi, he and I did a series of 7 interviews with some of our key partners as a starting point for understanding the state of data and metrics and how those things are being used, at least within the communities of practice directly involved with our project. And so this is not an exhaustive survey of the entire Rolodex of local food systems organizations. And as such, if the things that I'm saying either do or don't match with your experiences, please drop that in the comment section. You know, I don't want to turn it into a all booze or a peanut gallery too much, but I really do appreciate the opportunity to hear, like, this does not match with what we're doing, or this definitely feels like where we are. And so before I jump into those 3 themes, I do want to just acknowledge that data and metrics are really not a priority for some organizations, and they are a top priority for other organizations, some that we talk to and across. And by and large, most organizations are going to fall somewhere in the middle of that range. But I do think keeping that variability of priorities in mind is helpful to understand some of the things I'm going to talk about here in just a second. So the first point, again, I dropped it in the chat, but the first point here is this idea of the data for the organization itself versus data for and by the organization members. And so when you ask an organization that represents stakeholders about data and metrics, there's at least 2 levels of data that they could be talking about when they answer you. So the first one is the organizations collecting and using data directly themselves. And the other is supporting their stakeholders in collecting, accessing, analyzing data for themselves. So the stakeholders, people on the ground, you know, if the Farmers Market Coalition is the organization, I'm talking stakeholders are the farmers market vendors and markets that they represent. So the stakeholders might want to use data to make better business decisions, to help with production planning, prioritize the development of new products, or maybe even to apply for some funding of their own. Many of the organizations that we talk to are interested in that data primarily as a way to pursue funding. That could be the grant projects, all of the different ways that we pursue funding in this world. But they're also interested in things like better understanding their sector, making decisions to serve it better based on data. And the reason I mention this is that I think the approach to supporting these different levels of data collection is going to look different. And the outcomes and outputs from those processes are also going to probably look different. So supporting the organizations in collecting organizational data versus helping them help their clients. So the second point I have here is this notion of basic descriptive data and relational data, and maybe how those will relate. And so a majority of our interviewees indicated that they need better basic descriptive data about their sector. Or some of them said any descriptive data about their sector at all would be great. So that would include number of participants, number of customers, total sales, any of those things. Some of them, I think, even if we just had those 3 numbers, we would be very happy with that. We've probably heard that notion before, but interestingly, with this project and its intersectoral focus and across the food system, some of our interviewees went a step further to suggest that maybe using some of that improved descriptive data, along with improved descriptive data from other sectors, could help to contextualize their sector and also start to form these relational data sets. That could be maps, it could be old school kind of, spreadsheet-based data sets. But so just examples of that would be, is there a positive effect on resiliency of the local food system when there's a high density of local food actors in that area? Are there particular kinds of local food partners that serve as anchors? So is having a farmer's market in your community a good indicator of potential success for other actors, other participants? And which partnerships maybe tend to be the most mutually beneficial for your type of sector? And so this is like the hard problem of local food data. I'm not suggesting this is the, an innovative thing, but I do think considering the local food system as a collection of nested basic data, not necessarily super sexy, not necessarily the most exciting in terms of analysis, but in terms of utility, the basic data is still a need for a lot of the folks that we talk to. And so my last point here is about this notion of utility and considering what's the value of data collection, data aggregation, helping with analysis, et cetera, specifically for the communities of practice. I don't know that it's overly gauche to say that securing funding is the main way that these organizations use and value data. That's data in proposals, but also conversations with policymakers and politicians and reports on grants, et cetera. So these are literally the data that keep the lights on. So in organizations where that is true, those data sets form a patchwork of often small, inconsistent snapshots, usually related back to specific funding projects. To emphasize my earlier caveat before anyone, I understand this is not universal. Not all organizations are in this, we need the data so we can get the money, and that's all we think about data for. I know that there are people who are using it in really cool ways. So I just want to say, that is not what I'm saying. However, the way that we understand the local food data landscape is heavily impacted by this reality that a lot of organizations, this is the case for them. So I'm curious if that's the case for you all, is most of your data considerations are around either I have to do it to collect for a grant or I need data in order to justify getting money in the first place. So again, back to this concept of utility, keeping the lights on is a pretty compelling kind of utility. So that type of data collection it's kind of baked in. So I would posit that given the time and funding restraints many of these organizations face, if they're going to collect more data than is required by funders, we and they need to first have a clear picture of the utility of what those data are. I think most people would agree that in an optimal world, these organizations could and would be making better, more data-informed decisions, but in a less than optimal reality, prioritizing data work requires a good reason. And I think that was something that there was a sense of that in the conversations that we would really like to do that. It sounds awesome, but so I have a question for you all based on those responses, which is, as you think about the way that you currently use data or your clients currently use data, and you compare that to the way that you would optimally use it, ideally you'd like to use it for day-to-day decision-making or something like that, is the difference between those an issue that is a know-how issue, or is it a have-time issue? In other words, do you struggle to see what data might be useful beyond just getting funding, knowing how to access them, maybe where the data are, but you just can't get access because people won't share it with you, how those things might be used? Or do you have a pretty clear picture of how you would use that data and you just don't have the time, energy, or resources to do so? Your answer might be both. Your answer might be, Brett, you're crazy. We actually are using data at the highest and most sophisticated level that we ever hope to. And that's fine. These are not hypothetical, rhetorical questions. I would love to hear where you are in that. Is it more of a know-how issue or more of a have time, have energy, have money issue? So again, if any of these things the split in whether or not to prioritize data collection for your organization versus for the members that you represent, or whether the need for basic descriptive information is something that you're feeling. If any of these things are ringing true or not for you, I'd really love to hear that in the comments. Thank you very much.
And I love where the chat box is going, and I just keep it coming. And for the folks that say they're clients, can you give us a little bit more information about who exactly those clients are? Because it would help us just have a better sense of kind of that need. And another opportunity that this group has seen and has heard as an ask from communities is getting a better sense of how household purchases have changed over the last few years as a result of the COVID pandemic. And so hearing that request and need to have a better sense of those household changes, the group of the team here has done 2 surveys over the last 2 years of 5,000 households. And we have been able to analyze some of the results, and we will be sharing at the next webinar in April a deeper dive into this information. But I'm going to ask Dr. Dawn Thilmany to talk a little bit about the results here that we're sharing, and a little bit more about the survey.
Thanks, Libby. And without taking too much time, but to tell you that if this stuff is interesting to you or useful to your organizations, please join us in April. We have been trying to do what's a relatively unique survey. Usually when we look at food surveys, we're looking at specific foods or prices, all of which are very important too. But for this project, we got a very clear message that what the USDA has not been able to do historically is to really dig into the niche food marketing channels beyond, the big supermarkets and restaurants that are really important to this sector. And that's where we need to know where consumer behavior is really changing. So this is an example of where we've been trying to inform that discussion a bit. And it does make the slides a bit busier when you're not looking at 2 big buckets of food spending, but all the different ways consumers are spending their food dollars these days. And this is really some good news. What we see is that we continue to see what we call fragmentation, where an increasing number of US households have, although stayed mostly with supercenters and supermarkets, continue to explore buying at least some of their food purchases in a wider array of markets, including the ones represented by this community practice. So this is just a snippet of what we are now being able to show from our recent survey. Will let us compare immediately post-pandemic, October 2020, to how persistent that behavior has stayed through fall 2021. And so again, this is one place where we feel like we can add some data and information to the stories you're all trying to tell, but that we certainly would love to know more about how we can disentangle this data to make it interesting to you. There'll be an open discussion about that a month from now. And then also why we think this webinar today is so important, because besides what we can do centrally and nationally, we love learning what we can learn from what you are all collecting in your communities. So thank you for the time to introduce this, and we look forward to continuing to learn from our partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. I think, and then Libby, we've got one last question to put in the back of people's minds.
Well, and I think Jairus summed it up pretty well in the chat box, and so I'm going to go with that. So Jairus posted, what do you need to communicate the value of your organization, your sector, your ideas to policymakers, funders, and consumers? And so we want that to kind of be, I'm going to plant that as a seed in your mind, and then we're going to have these amazing panelists talk about their experiences as kind of like the fertilizer water. And I just want to see where that tiny little seed grows. There is 2 feet of snow outside where I am. So if any kind of like little green thing coming out would make me very happy. So I'm going to post that in the chat box, and then we're going to give you some time after we hear the panelists speak to put your response into the chat box. So you don't necessarily have to have one ready to go, but we just want plant that little seed, and then I'll hand it back to Lillian.
Thanks. Thank you to my project team. Thank you to Libby for knowing that one thing that delights me in this world is an extended metaphor. So thank you for that. And so as you see, we've got a lot going on in the project, and we're really fortunate to be able to sit with these questions that are so key for local and regional food systems and thinking about what's the future that we're building towards together. And we're really so lucky to be joined today by three incredible panelists, and we're going to get into the conversation. So I'll invite those who aren't actively part of the panel to turn their videos off and mute. And I will say hello to Anna Valuev, Kalia Souza, and I'm sorry if I should have written phonetic pronunciations for everyone, and Sahir Advani, who come to us from three very different places in this journey of the data metrics journey. And I will try not to overextend that metaphor. So let's hear from them first, and we'll go in first name alphabetical order. Can you all say hello? Tell us a little about your organization and the current issue, motivation, or opportunity that you're working on. I'm doing this instead of reading bios for you. That is always my least favorite part of being a panelist, is having someone read my bio that I had to write for myself. So I'm going to let you do your own sort of bios and tell us where you're at currently in the work that you're working on. And we'll start with Anna.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate today, and for that great introduction, and just awesome to get a little bit of primer on some of the work that all of you are doing. Really looking forward to this conversation. So like I mentioned, my name is Anna Valuev. I'm Deputy Director of the Opportunity Project, which we also refer to as TOP, which is an innovation initiative out of the US Census Bureau. We're one of the flagship programs of the Census Open Innovation Labs. And really what we do is bring together government, technologies, and communities through 12 to 14-week technology development sprints. And we work with these diverse stakeholders to develop digital tools that are powered by federal open data. So we work with federal agencies, local governments, and NGOs to define national challenges in need of data or tech innovation. And then over the course of the sprint, the technologists from private sector companies and academic institutions use federal open data, often combined with private sector data, to develop apps, maps, data visualizations, and other digital tools for the public. And over the last 6 years, we've worked on challenges from disaster response to ocean plastic pollution to assisting recently resettled refugees and everything in between. So really just here to talk a little bit about this methodology that can be used and modified in lots of different settings by different organizations to use data and really facilitate cross-sector collaboration.
Thank you, Anna. Kalia, tell us about yourself and your work.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Kalia Souza, and I'm the Food System Equity and Advocacy Specialist with Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems. So a little bit about our center. Our mission is to engage the people of Michigan, the U.S., and essentially the world in applied research, education, outreach to develop regionally integrated sustainable food systems. So we work very holistically across the entire food system. And we believe in collective impact, the idea that complex social problems are best solved when organizations in diverse sectors actively commit to a common agenda. So oftentimes we function as a collective impact backbone organization, convening partners across the state and nationally to promote food that's healthy, green, fair, and affordable. So in my role at MSU Center for Regional Food Systems, I work across a number of different state level, local, national projects that in terms of metrics and data collection tend to be focused on process development to guide the work or create standards, or developing frameworks that capture the soft metrics, which I'll come back around to in just a second. But some of these projects include working with the Nutrition Incentive Hub, which is part of the Nutrition Incentive Program, National Training, Technical Assistance, Evaluation, and Information Center as a TA provider for local and regional sourcing. Also serve on the National Farm to School Network Racial Equity and Farm to School Advisory Group. I co-facilitate the Michigan Local Food Council Network and provide advisement to the NYU Tandon School of Engineering GovLab 100 Questions initiative. So just real quick to finish up, when I say soft metrics, I'm referring to those complex, oftentimes highly contextual shifting data points. So for example, defining and measuring how we shift power at multiple levels in the system. What is the role of trust in these systems? And very much so in the infancy stages of several of these things and the initiatives that I'm working across.
Super interesting. I can't wait to dive more. Hi, Sahir, coming to us from Vancouver. Tell us about yourself and your work.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sahir Bani. I'm a postdoc at the University of Maine, and I work in Joshua Stoll's lab. I previously used to work as part of the distribution team in a community sport fishery here in Vancouver. But currently, as I mentioned, I'm working in Joshua Stoll's lab, and one of the local catch network is an organization that is housed at this lab. And the local catch network is one of the 17 networks within this network of networks that we're currently in a webinar for. And so in case you're not aware of it, so local catch it's a community of practice that's made up of seafood harvesters, technical assistance providers, as well as researchers and other organizations. Its aim is to strengthen local and regional food systems through a focus on local and direct seafood marketing. And understanding community sport fisheries. And so the work that Joshua Stoll and I are currently doing is we're co-developing a national survey of direct seafood marketing. And the purpose of the survey is to really understand the scale and the diversity of the sector. The survey is being conducted in collaboration with the University of Maine, the US Department of Agriculture, the National Marine Fisheries Service, as well as the local catch network. Thanks.
Fantastic. So, and we've had a request in the chat, so we will be sure to get names and websites out to you all. And as a point of process, after every webinar we do a sort of written 2 to 3 page summary. So if you want to come back and like, oh, there were some great points, or what was that conversation? You want to share it with someone else who's unlikely to sit through a 90-minute webinar, that'll be a resource there too. And also links to our partner organizations there. So as you've seen, we are the luckiest people with this project. We get the most interesting folks to join our conversations. And a major theme that we're hoping to explore today is this idea of not just the what of data, not just the numbers in the spreadsheets or whatever that is, but that process. As you saw from the opening of this webinar, our research team, our whole project team is really in the midst of this process of defining, measuring, and creating data and then putting that data to work. So we're going to explore that whole spectrum of work there. And so I'll invite our panelists. So do you have a story from your work of what that process of establishing or refining or expanding your work with data is? Because as you've heard, like our 3 panelists are in very different places in that spectrum, right? Like sometimes, as we heard from Brett and Jairus earlier, we have no data and lots of questions. And sometimes maybe if you're the federal government, you have lots of data that you need to ask questions with. So we'll start with you because you're right above me in my square here. Like, what's that process been like? What is motivating your work right now, and how's that looking?
Awesome, thanks, Lillian. So the USDA has been catalyzing investment in food systems for a while. And it's been conducting the local food marketing practices survey since 2015, and the most recent iteration was in 2020. In parallel to that, while the direct marketing sector has been growing in the agricultural space, direct seafood marketing has been growing organically. It's been around for a while, and a lot of community supported fisheries have been adopting the model that's been pitched by CSAs. So while there's been a lot of stories and research of the importance and value of direct seafood marketing, and the sector itself, understanding the sector has real-world implications for the management of fisheries, there's no real data on this sector. The sector's been pretty invisible so far. However, with the start of the pandemic and the increased interest in local food systems and local food, there was increased visibility and engagement in direct seafood marketing. And so the sector received a bump with a lot of fishers as well, seeing interest in engaging in direct marketing because of the closure of other markets. And so what we're trying to do is we're really trying to develop a benchmark estimate of the scale of the sector, as well as the diversity of the direct marketing channels that are there. And so that's why we're really conducting focus groups with the industry in the initial stages to really understand how the industry views themselves. And ultimately, those insights will be put into, will be incorporated into the survey and the survey design.
Perfect. And I'm going to ask a bunch more questions about what you've learned through that process later. Kalia, you are in the interesting middle space, right? Like you're working with pretty well-established sectors. What's that process?
So, just referring back to the example I shared in my introduction about attempting to measure concepts like power shifting across systems, much of my work, although not necessarily all, is focused on racial equity. So a little bit of context setting, a really critical note. There's a conflict about measuring equity within existing systems of inequity. And this is where we tend to have a lot of exploration. We're bound to some extent by the system container that we're operating in. So across any one of my projects, what I try to work on is how do we address the unseen people and processes, the blind spots hidden by the systems, or oftentimes hidden by the systems. With people, for example, we often miss huge segments because data collection is focused to priority populations, not to say that we can't gather additional data that's useful to our work, even outside of those populations, but we have to balance out, time, funding, feasibility, urgency, and we have different stakeholder audiences to cater to. But, this is where the question of shifting, dismantling, and or transforming systems comes into play. So just talking across some of the projects that I work on, I'm going to try to draw out themes for all of you from across multiple projects. There's been a lot of data collection around farm to school and an overabundance of purchasing data, but not necessarily any metrics. However, the question to ask is whether that reflects the deeper goals and opportunities of farm to school. I even mentioned earlier that the work of the Racial Equity Advisory Group for National Farm to School Network, it's in the very nascent stage of defining what conditions need to be tracked, whereas the 100 Questions Initiative that I work on has developed 10 critical questions for data collection among 10 distinct sectors, one of those being food system sustainability. Looking at the data collection I've been involved in with the Nutrition Incentive Hub to develop standards and metrics around local and regional sourcing. We've developed the questions, we've collected some preliminary data, and we've identified themes that would inform the development of metrics. And here in particular, we've gotten down to what Brett was talking about earlier with relational data and how that plays into our understanding of how local and regional food systems move to support local and regional sourcing. And the questions were specifically designed to question assumptions, as well as reveal processes unfolding within those systemic contexts, both broadly in terms of the grant program, so that container, and within the localities, regions, cities, and what does that dynamic interplay look like? So with any of these projects, it's just highlighted how critical it is to pose the right questions up front to lead the process.
Fantastic. Thank you, Clea. Again, many things to come back to. So Anna, you all have this process is fascinating and probably one that's a little overwhelming for those of us who are new to tech spaces or, working with our own Excel spreadsheets, and that's as sophisticated as our data gets. What is the opportunity project process, and what do you find exciting and inspiring about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So we work with, federal government agencies and increasingly state and local governments as well. And, every year help them develop problem statements that really define the social and environmental challenges that they're asking technologists to tackle throughout the sprint. And we also work with them to identify relevant federal data sets that those technologists can then use, because one of our key missions of the Opportunity Project is really to increase the use and reuse of federal open data. And what we found is that oftentimes, an agency might be very familiar with the policy challenge, but might not always know all of the data sets that could be relevant, as the data might come, from different federal agencies, or even we've seen sit within their own agency, but it's a different part, and so they're not aware of it. What we've done is that over the course of the 6 years, we've really developed partnerships with data experts and chief data officers across the federal ecosystem. So once we know, what the policy challenge is, we reach out to our network to help ensure that we're curating a comprehensive starting point of really topic-specific data, because what we've seen across different agencies and just in general with federal data is that it can be really difficult to navigate for the public, and even for folks who are data users. The data sits in lots of different places. It's not that easy to search data.gov. And so we really try to curate an initial set of 15 or 20 data sets that we really believe are relevant to that particular topic. And so it can be really helpful also to develop those problem statements that really illustrate the questions that those data sets can answer, or problems that it can solve, so that it's not, just a list of data, but really the data is framed around a particular challenge or topic. And then lastly, once those sprints start, we bring in data stewards to represent each of those data sets, and they help the technologists navigate the data, find other data sets that might be relevant. Because while we as government collect and disseminate so much data, it can really be tricky for folks from the public to get, answers on the data, and on the flip side, for the federal agencies to get feedback on the data that they're sharing with the public.
That's really helpful. Anna, I'd like to stay with you for a second here. And I'd love for us all to sort of dig into specifics, because as a sociologist, my brain works best with stories. Is there an example from past projects of an unexpected way, or a novel, or maybe a delightful way that federal data was put to work for the public good through this process?
Yeah, absolutely. So last year, the Census Bureau began releasing data from the 2020 decennial census. And we actually facilitated a sprint last fall with university-based technologists. So they were undergrads, grad students, artists, and designers. And we tasked them with not only developing digital tools, but also, works of art and design to really help the public engage with data, and help themselves see themselves in the data, particularly as we know that there are communities that are historically and currently undercounted in the census. We really thought that this was an opportunity to help the public understand, not only see themselves in the data, but also understand kind of the relevance and importance of the counting effort. And so what we saw was a whole host of products that really went beyond our typical, digital tools. So we saw a group of students develop an Instagram page developed specifically to bolster Asian American owned businesses that posted visualizations of demographic data, but also helped connect businesses to potential customers. We saw a card game concept developed to help students learn about the census that incorporated facts from decennial data. We saw a product that helped librarians identify more diverse books to add to their collections that use demographic data from the census. And we saw really unique visualizations of food insecurity in America that really sought to show, not only the quantitative elements of food insecurity, but also told stories of specific people who are facing food insecurity. And so really through the sprint, we saw how creative the public can be with data, and that it can be really used to help Americans connect with data that might not otherwise know that it exists, or feel like they can connect or access it. And so really just to make it more digestible, we were able to bring in these really unique and new audiences to help us develop those tools. So that's just one example, and I'm excited to share more throughout this talk, but really the more diverse people we can bring in to use government and non-government data sources, the more the public can really connect with it.
That's so fantastic. And it adds another layer to this question of the process of working with data, that it's not that the way we tell the stories and that the way we come to understandings should be as diverse as and inclusive as any part of the process. Wow. And also, Anna, this is me also telling my colleagues, let's be sure to find a link to some of those examples to sort of inspire us about, Libby's on it. That's how good we are. So so let's keep with telling some stories. Kalia, I saw you sort of nodding a lot during what Anna was saying. What has been this process of learning to ask the right questions or a surprising or delightful outcome?
So the first thing that came to mind is addressing that question with a question, and that often leads to work. Who gets to decide what the questions are in the first place? So, I'd argue that that should be derived from those whom the programmatic efforts are focused on, whether that's a food hub operator along the supply chain or the community at large. And that's something that we've grappled with both within the National Farm to School Network Racial Equity Advisory Group and the Michigan Local Food Council Network. So with the Racial Equity Advisory Group, I think that we may have started out with the intention of a more straightforward process to developing those metrics. And I could say that was certainly the case with the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Team that we convened for the Michigan Local Food Council Network to help us create the conversations that would then lead us to the questions we should be asking within the network that would then lead our work to shift and share power and evaluate that. But within each of these spaces, what we did was we practiced equitable and inclusive process. And we found ourselves needing to back that process up because you oftentimes go in with a lot of assumptions, based on where you are at within that work. And once you start creating more inclusive and equitable process, bringing in others who have different perspectives and levels of knowledge and expertise, or so to speak, then it becomes that work of trying to level out the playing field that you all are on and creating shared language, shared understanding. So we really took time in both of those spaces to more deeply explore the root systems, their dynamics, and those influences on the people who ultimately make the decisions around those systems and implement the solutions. And that's really complex in terms of creating metrics. So developing the processes that help to elevate the knowledge and expertise that already exists in communities and systems is part of transforming the way we traditionally design data collection and identify metrics, in my opinion.
Fantastic. It's here. I mean, we're going from both ends of the spectrum and back again. Like you're starting absolutely from scratch, but I hear a lot of, from what I've learned from you about your process, a lot of those principles are embedded in the work you're doing. How has your approach to asking questions changed through this survey instrument development process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Lillian. And this speaks a lot to what Kalia was mentioning, that yes, we're really interested in learning from the community, that is the industry, like direct seafood marketers, in terms of how they describe themselves, how they describe the channels that they're engaging with. Because at the end of the day, this is going to be a national survey. And the terms that we use in the survey really need to be applicable across the entire country. Because from our current understanding of the literature on the sector, there are these varied names for the same marketing channel. And so trying to get some sense of a common language that could be used in a national survey is one of the things that we're really trying to work on. And so we're foundational in that is these focus groups with the industry. But I'd also like to talk about the fact that, so beyond just the metrics of the questions that we're asking, we also recognize the value of this data. And because so much of the management process is driven by this quantitative value, that this data is currency, it's, as to quote Brett, it's what keeps the lights on. And so by conducting the survey, we're creating a value for the direct marketing sector, and in the hopes that it'll also help determine allocations for the sector down the road.
Yeah, I'm going to add on to that because I've had the benefit of some like inside baseball with Sahir and Josh when he says allocation. So I didn't know this. I come from flyover country, right? Like we don't have, although I learned there's 48 commercial fisheries in the Great Lakes. The fisheries are so cool because they're working with wild populations held in commons, right? In federal waters, and that there are quotas allocated to either commercial or recreational fisheries. And so this is something you were going to say later, forgive me, but I find it fascinating. And so like when this data keeps the lights on, data also determines how many fish can be put in the nets, so that these are quotas that are set, and the access to the fish for the fisheries is allocated through this data. So it's like data does so much work for us when we are engaged in collective processes over big spaces and diverse communities. And I was thinking also about what you said earlier, Kalia, about the deeper goals of local regional food system work. And I think one of the challenges that we inevitably bump up against in trying to do shared collaborative work across the wild world of local food systems is creating space for the many goals and values that we as individuals, as communities, as stakeholder groups bring to the work. Data is not value neutral, despite our best efforts, right? It is systematic, but there are always values embedded in how we shape these questions, and then in the way that analysis happens, and we can shift that, right? It's not innate or inevitable, which I think is what's inspiring about this conversation in a lot of ways. Okay, that's enough of me rambling. Well, I just think these examples are so illustrative, Anna. So Anna, federal systems are sort of slow and difficult to navigate despite our best interests. Working for a large bureaucracy myself, like we're all living in that place. How is this opportunity project and COIL process pushing the status quo? Like, how is that design process from the tech world nudging the system?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So through this program, we really want to tackle challenges as quickly and as efficiently as we can. What is really helpful to us is that there are no contracts or dollars changing hands through the program. So, agencies don't pay us to participate and develop those problem statements. The tech teams are not paid and don't pay to participate. So it's a really lightweight method for government to collaborate with the private sector, and often something that's really new for federal agencies, because they're used to collaborating with the private sector only through, contracts or procurement. And so this is just a really different methodology. It takes us less than 2 months to, finalize the problem statements, recruit the tech teams, and actually launch the sprints. And because we're collaborating with the private sector, which is known for working often more quickly than the federal ecosystem, they're used to the faster paced nature and really appreciate those 12 to 14 week sprints, because they're able to dedicate, some staff time during that allocated amount of time, but only for a few months. And so it's much easier for them to commit resources, especially given that, they're volunteering their time, but they own the products at the end of the sprint. And so, what we try to do is find real alignment between the organizations that we're reaching out to participate as tech teams and the problem statement, so that there's, shared value that they can then really make, a business case if they're, a for-profit company, or really serve the public and the organizations that they are already working with on the nonprofit side. And so really finding that alignment and bringing the right stakeholders into the process really helps us make sure that we're able to work quickly and efficiently, but also, create opportunities that have value to everyone who's participating.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. Like again, and this comes back to making the process valuable. Kalia, you work across so many sectors. Can this process be done in a way, or have you seen it done in a way that builds capacity within the organizations, within the community, so that this work in and of itself is a capacity building? Because what Anna's describing is, man, that's a lot of, we're bringing capacity into the context. And is there also a way that it can build it from the ground up?
Yeah, so you know what? Let me start here. I think it's about opening up what we think of traditionally as data, and how do we think about stories and experience being incorporated. into this. So to Anna's point, even earlier about collecting data quickly, also I think we often approach data collection as a very comprehensive undertaking that requires significant amount of time with planning, great expertise, et cetera. And yes, I mean, depending upon what kind of data we're trying to collect to inform whatever process, that certainly is the case. But that investment and capacity that's needed, how do we develop and incorporate like continuous responsive feedback loops that give us small sets of data more often to adapt systems? I think that is very key. And certainly we saw this during COVID where, we were shook and we had to operate on limited information because this was a new situation and we needed to be able to look at the system as it was changing and respond quickly. So, I'll uplift the soft metrics in this and, that revealing of the relational network, relational nature of the work. That's what I call kind of the in-between space that makes things move. We don't necessarily know how to create straightforward metrics for these things. I think about the role that trust plays in systems operating. How do you foster that? How do you measure that and the role that it's playing in a system? So just when we think about justice and equity and inclusion in all of this and trying to build capacity within communities, I think we need to think of data collection beyond just being, an activity in and of itself that then becomes somewhat divorced from the program and what it's trying to achieve ultimately. It's kind of set over here. And sometimes we'll interview some people at the end and develop a report for the grantor or whatever other stakeholder. But when we look at our data as changing ourselves and changing our systems, and shifting the lens and the capacity and competencies of whoever it is that's evaluating to truly center and embed notions of justice and equity in the work. That's where we can start shifting the way that we collect data and what we think of as usable data.
I love that point of collecting small bits on a more regular basis, right? The census is phenomenal and so much work, right? There's a reason we don't do it every 10 years. And those of us, I think, who work, the best thing about surveys is anyone can do one. And the worst thing about surveys is anyone can do one. And we'll have folks like, oh, we're going to do this 200 question survey and we're going to just ask all the questions. And often I'll ask, do you think you're going to do a better job than the ag census on that level of detail and the scope that you're proposing? Let's work smarter and more strategically and what we as researchers or as organizations are most strategically positioned to explore and to ask about,
And Lillian, I just got to jump in when you said that real quick. Let's get real. How many everyday people are going to go read 100 pages of evaluation and then figure out how to apply that to the work that we're doing? I do evaluation, oftentimes don't have time to read through every single report that we have made. So, data is oftentimes as good as it is usable and immediately applicable to something. So if it's going to sit in a report on a shelf because you need an expert to read through 250 pages of a report, then that's problematic.
Yeah, accessibility and relevance is as critical a dimension as accuracy. Accessibility, relevance, and accuracy, all of these pieces. I love that. So as I promised, this is the conversation for Data Dorks. I'm so glad you came. I'm so glad everyone came today. I hope you're enjoying this as much as I have. So here, I want to be sure to make time to talk about your work in capturing the complexity of the direct marketing sector. And did you come to the survey with one thought about how direct marketing would work? And then how is the complexity of the sector changed the process and changed the construction? How are you thinking about it now that's different? You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. I know what you're saying. I get you. So yeah, when I joined this project, potentially 5 months ago, I thought, okay, this is going to be it's the direct marketing sector. There's some research out there. There have been manuals published over the years in terms of what are the different marketing channels that folks can engage with. Should be pretty cut and dry in terms of talking about the different channels and then conducting the survey. But what we're learning is that there isn't just one type of direct marketing or even a consistent definition of it. Because the direct seafood sector is taking lessons from the agricultural sector, but also from the existing supply chains that they've been operating in. There's been this hybridization of terms being used, which potentially, if left unexamined, could conflate responses down the road. So I don't want to go into specific details of it because that would just put me on a tangent. But basically what we're finding out that there's a spectrum of these direct marketing relationships. And by talking with the industry, by really getting their sense of what they're talking about, what they're engaging with, we're hoping to really capture this diversity and also then design the survey better.
Keep moving my mouse off of mute. It's so interesting. And I think that this question of values and goals and the way that they shape seemingly objective points of measurement is really interesting. And I've also taken the facilitator's prerogative. So part of my work previously was really deep in the farm institution metric space. And I also, like, despite in addition to these discussions of complexity and contextualizing, which is vital and critical and essential, we can also take hope in the fact that relatively simple metrics, like how much produce was purchased as part of a local food spend, as opposed to how much prepared foods were purchased, can tell us really interesting things about what's happening in the farm institution space, right? So an example from my previous work at University of Kentucky by not just saying how many dollars did we spend on local food, real talk, like that's kind of a useless metric, doesn't tell us much, right? Because we don't even know what local means in that context. But if we say how much source identified animal protein was purchased, those are two different metrics that when we bring them together, it tells us something really interesting about what's happening in the farm institution space. And at my previous institution, we were looking at meats and dairy and produce as part of our breakdown of the spend, and could say that, yeah, despite, more than $1 million of local food purchases, only $18,000 in the last year was spent on fresh, unprocessed produce. Simple facts that can then be used to talk about and get to is what's happening aligned with our goals and our values for this work. So take heart, right? Yeah. Okay, we've got sort of two more buckets of questions I'm hoping to explore with these amazing panelists, and then heads up to those of you who are still with us. I'm hoping most people stayed. We're gonna go to Q&A and we're gonna revisit the question that Libby posed at the beginning. So, can technology be a friend, right? I do love some bells and whistles as much as I love a grassroots approach, but like, let's go thoughtfully. Where can new and emergent digital technologies or strategies help us in this quest to understand our work and how we're doing it? Anna, let's start with you, because you've got I think you're doing the most sophisticated tech work in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's a great question, especially as we think about, how can we marry the awesome public sector data that we have with, data that's being collected by the private sector. And so just as an example of really a novel and interesting way of using private data to supplement some existing federal open data, last year we worked with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and really they identified a need to better understand how movements of people during the pandemic would impact housing trends and the need for new and different social and economic resources and how those resources might shift. As many of you know, federal data often lags. And so it was quite difficult during the pandemic to really identify how people were moving more permanently and how that might affect, longer term trends and resource allocations, just because our data often, is released a year sometimes more after the people have moved, right? And so what we did was really think about, okay, who from the private sector might have the data that we might be looking for to answer some of those questions. And what we did was actually engage Google, which combined federal demographic data from Census, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and others with their own proprietary, of course, de-identified aggregated mobile device data to identify areas in the country where people had moved to or left. And so they were actually able to look at cell phone pings of people who had changed locations and were in a new location for over, a set number of weeks or months to, to identify where people were either moving to or leaving, and develop this really cool tool to enable governments to more accurately anticipate needs and opportunities, because federal data on its own maybe couldn't do that. And so that's a really interesting example of, how we think about bringing these different data sets together and really just like the expertise and the knowledge of both the public sector and the private sector together to answer some really critical questions that one on its own would really have trouble answering.
That's so fascinating. And it's something I never would have thought about. That's why this is so great. And Kalia, since farm institution's top of mind, because I was ranting about it, I mean, we hear, how can we make the lives of I want to say lunch ladies, but like school nutrition service providers easier, right? There's lots of data, but I think I hear from anecdotally that working with the procurement data is the biggest challenge. Is there a way that we can make their lives easier?
Okay, so I think that's like the $1 million question. If we knew the exact answer for how to do that, then we would resolve everybody's capacity issues in this space, and then this might be a different webinar. But yeah, Lillian, when you were saying that, I was thinking that is one of the questions in the farm to institution space. And then thinking about, if we were to be able to free up some of that time and energy, then what else could we be doing? So the way I look at it is, what processes and systems need to be put in place to support and capture, even some of the nuances that are not being captured by our standardized processes right now, that may then also lend themselves to a better understanding of what's happening. So there's two things that I think about, and I don't know, exactly what systems support this. So maybe Sahir and Anna have some ideas on this. And I think we've talked about this a little bit. So one is data democracy, enabling everyone in an organization, a community or otherwise, regardless of what their technical expertise is, to understand and work with data comfortably, to feel confident talking about it, and then ultimately be able to make data-informed decisions, at whatever level that they are operating in, that they need to apply data to design evidence-based systems, processes, experiences. And then I also look to tribal communities and the idea of data sovereignty. Certainly, tribal nations have their own government separate from our federal government, and then data collection looks different there. So what would it look like to take an idea like that and transfer it to local communities, for example? And again, then what are these systems and processes that we put in place? Or if not local communities, we can talk about the farm to institution space. And I know that we get into the trickier parts about disaggregated data and proprietary data, but then it's exactly that. How do we, understanding those issues, start to work through that and incorporate it into those support structures and systems that we create to make it easier for people to use data at multiple levels in the way that it helps to make their decision making on a daily basis.
That's super fascinating. I was having this amazing conversation with someone working in sort of nutritional security, food justice, and about the variability of access to SNAP and WIC data, even on an aggregated level, state to state, community to community. And for me, this is an individual opinion, like public data, and Anna, your work is directly speaking to this, should be in the service of the public, and recognizing the limitations and the sort of problems in the way that data can be racialized. actually, there is, I believe, this is what I was told, and someone please correct me, that when someone signs up for supplemental nutrition assistance, a racial category has to be assigned if it's not provided. Or is that WIC? Someone please fact check me. So there's all these, so the process is as critical. And I shouldn't say things I don't know for sure, so I apologize for that. So the process is as critical. And FOIA is an amazing tool. I think if we always acted as if our data could be secured through a Freedom of Information Act through a public institution, then we start to think about it as in service to the public in really interesting ways, which lets our public institutions be accountable in, like, allows us to be accountable in really interesting and important ways to the communities that we serve. So that's, again, my farm institution nerd hat. But so here, before we move on from this technology piece, your process, again, back to basics, not in a really important way, of figuring out your sample set was really cool. And like, are there other ways that digital technologies and social media are informing your work?
Yeah, so I'd say there are potentially two approaches. And so, or there are two approaches. So the direct seafood marketing sector is using technology to pivot to these online sales, especially in the last couple of years. But for us and for the project, we're using technology to help, as you mentioned, expand our list frame. And so, going back to my first point, that this pivot to digital marketing, while it's also a tool for direct marketers, it also serves as a data point or a point data collection for the sales, the market demographics, and so it's been super valuable not only to these direct marketers, but it's also been valuable to researchers to understand also just the interest in the sector. So for example, Joshua Stoll published a paper using Google Analytics in terms of foot traffic data in direct seafood marketing operations versus conventional seafood markets. And there was a difference. In other instances, so as I mentioned, we're using web scraping. So we're literally trawling the web to understand how folks are engaging in online sales of seafood. And where the hope is that beyond the existing list stream that we have, that we've collected from government records, we should also be able to collect additional information and capture other actors that may not have been part of this system. And this exact approach has been adopted by the USDA in its local food marketing practices survey. So we're just taking a leaf out of their hat. So yeah.
That's so cool. All right, so home stretch, final questions. I think I saved the hardest ones for last, and then we're gonna, well, I can't promise that because we've got really thoughtful attendees who are gonna ask you all questions too. And so something that I'm carrying forward from this conversation is thinking of the work of data and metrics as a dialogue, right? As a conversation rather than a monologue. And I'm just so thankful that we've had that dialogue here today. And to Kalia's point earlier about like smaller, regular check-ins, reflections, refinement. And if we can take that idea of the process of collecting and analyzing data as an ongoing conversation with the communities of interest, at the point that was made earlier in the conversation, how do our approaches and our methods and our outputs change? Which is sort of like, we're going to summarize all the great examples we heard earlier in the conversation. I think we've heard examples of that through here. And to start where we began, Kalia, I'm going to go to you first. What would it take, or have you seen ways that that we can help communities or organizations get off this reporting to data collection treadmill, right? Collecting to keep the lights on, because it is critical. We've heard through this conversation, not only does data keep the lights on in terms of grant funding, data keeps the fish in nets, data keeps the housing resources flowing to where they're needed. So this is a critical piece of like how we engage in the public economy. Anyway, but so are there ways to start that process of getting off the treadmill?
I think part of that is knowing what kind of power we hold in this system and how we leverage it. So I know funding plays such an influential role in shaping our data goals. And most communities that I've worked with and worked in are looking for funding that's more open-ended and allows them to address their understanding of their priority issues in their community. They are experts, to a great extent in their context that they're working in. And I actually worked for a kind of community organizing based health equity initiative that was run through a public health department where that approach was taken. Like, here, let's let the community work on the thing that they define, because they're going to be more bought into it anyway. And then we, as the those who got the funding but handed it over to the community and said, here are the things that you can and can't do, but we're going to let you do that. Then we played the role with the funder to say, what they are doing fits within your context in this way. So we played that intermediary role to allow the community to exercise their power. And based on the knowledge that we had, with the power that we had, that's where we played this kind of translation with the funder. And I think that was the best thing that we did, to allow the community to work in the way that they knew best. And then we leveraged our power to kind of shift the conversation and the understanding with the funder. So, even within that space, to try to get closer to allowing more open-endedness, or that box to be expanded. If we want to change, our spaces and places, how do we create those working dynamics that build the time and the funding for relationship development as well? We don't usually get that in a grant. You get 3 to 5 years to do something that it may take 3 years just to do the relationship development and build the trust it takes to implement the project in the first place. So again, what can we evaluate in that helps us to design better, more sustainable systems? And I'll just give this last example of, working in communities that often became the subject or the petri dish for research and evaluation, because they hit all of those things that funders are often looking for that describes a priority population. And the sentiment that I often got from the community was that whatever was done was not sustainable, it didn't last, and community members were tired of being put in that position of being researched and evaluated, for lack of better words, lab rats. So if we can build up, going back to an earlier question, Lillian, the capacity of communities for self-determination and design the evaluation, the data collection that promotes that, then maybe we'll better get to the place we're trying to get to with that participatory approach.
That question of relationship and trust building, I'll share with you all, has been a through line, especially of this 2.0 of our COVID project too, and really thinking about how, the sort of emotional and community and social labor that it takes to put in the foundations to do the work that we share the ideals of going. And so here, it just struck me that that Local Catch in some ways has been laying that foundation for years. Could you do this survey if Local Catch didn't exist, or how would it look different, right? So that's one question that just occurred in my mind. And then given that you do have that network and you're growing it in this dialogue, what's going to happen once it's in the future world? You've done an amazing survey, got an incredible response rate, because everyone here is going to tell everyone they know what the boat to fill it out. What's the sharing out process going to look like? What are you thinking?
Mm-hmm. So I'll answer your last question first. And the aspiration with this work is that federal organizations institutionalize the survey, where it's going to be a benchmark assessment. We're basically providing a proof of concept of how this work could be done. But our aspiration is that it's institutionalized. But yes, also going back this work is also, it's not being done in a silo. Local Catch Network's been operating for, I believe, more than a decade. And part of the broader work that Local Catch does is, one, it focuses research in this space or in the sphere of direct seafood marketing. It provides technical assistance to the industry in terms of, leveraging programs like USDA's funding and stuff, their efforts to scale your catch, or the workshops to help practitioners or in the industry expand their operations. And it's at the end of the day, it's also really about network building. That's the key role one of the key goals of the Local Catch Network. It's really building this community of practitioners and this community of practice amongst like-minded folk. And ultimately, the Local Catch's, say, motto or way of operating really, I feel, champions this aspect of it being a dialogue rather than just a monologue from one agency or a research institution.
Yeah. And now, Anna, we're going to come to you soon. And I'm thinking about, like, what if one of the ways that the survey data you're doing, so if there was a game made out of it. Ever since Anna introduced the ideas of games and all these like cool ways of doing it, that was a way for people like me to understand fisheries allocation and sort of the impacts on ecologies, but also economies of coastal communities and the role of working waterfronts and all that stuff. Like, let's make a game, right? Wouldn't that be fun? Okay, so Ms. Anna, have big institutions, the federal governments, we think of them as like eternal and immutable, but they are also always evolving and changing. They're made up of people just like us. How has the work of COIL and the Opportunity Project and those partnerships, has it changed the landscape or the ethos of federal data work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the fact that the program has been around for over 6 years, we've really been able to share with federal agencies a really different way of working, collaborating with the private sector, increasing the use of their data. And so, over 25 agencies have participated. Technologists have used over 300 federal data sets. We've catalyzed the development of over 80 products. But, I think the biggest kind of impacts go back to what Clea was just talking about participatory design and really making sure that what we're building is actually, has the needs and the challenges of the communities for which we're building it at the heart. And so one of the real mechanisms that we use to do that is to focus on human-centered design and to bring in, NGOs and folks with lived experience of these challenges into the process, so that we're not building for them, but we're really building with them. And so those folks are there from the very start, working with the tech companies on user research, really making sure that those organizations understand what has been done in the communities before, what are the actual needs and what is feasible. And then, are there throughout as the teams are presenting a concept or a demo, we're able to then kind of course correct if the products that are coming out or the way that the data is being presented or used isn't resonating with the community, or just isn't quite meeting the mark of what is actually needed, so that we don't get to the end and have these products that just don't have relevance in the actual communities. And so to us, really, that shift in having community engagement as a norm of the way that we work, both within the federal government and really encouraging, the private sector to think about it as well, is something that we really see as a lasting impact of the program beyond just, the products and the data sets being used, but really a shift in the way that we're thinking about, the use of data and the development of digital tools more broadly.
I really want to throw something into what you're talking about, Anna, with this human-centered design process. And there's also been some comments in the chat box, and I want to uplift that, about feelings that might be held among Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, or businesses that are minority run in this space. And this idea of not just representation, but authentic participation, I think absolutely falls in line when we're talking about this in our systems of inequity. Falls in line with what you're talking about with human-centered design, but keeping in mind the kind of systems that we created that disadvantage certain people.
Thanks, Clea. And I was so yes, it's not done. And this is sort of the end of what we had planned for the conversation. I want to open our Q&A maybe first to our panelists, or give them a time to think of, like, is there a question that you would ask of each other, or a question you'd like to explore more based on what you've learned today? And then we're also, please, y'all put your questions in the chat, and I'm going to try to scroll through. I think My colleague Brett had a really great question about tensions between funders and work. Brett, there's so many good stuff in the chat here. I'm trying to scroll back up to it. Let me see. Do you all have examples of finding harmony between priorities from funders or political bodies and the priorities and experiences of people we're supposed to be serving? Is there a tension in your work? So where there's alignment or misalignment between funding or programmatic priorities and then the desires of the communities that they're targeting?
I'll just throw in a quick comment on that because I see that Brett said Kalia did address that in part. But, you know, when I think about the type of strategies that we employ to address food insecurity, for example, maybe outside of the particular sectors that we're often working in. So balancing some of those tensions, I think about working in the food security space, the importance of voter engagement and civic participation and building up capacity around those things, because then we get down to the decision makers who are in place that, and whether or not they're truly representative of the interests of the people. So, you know, sometimes we kind of have to go through a back door rather than a front door to address some of the issues that we're dealing with in the food system.
Thanks, Kalia. And go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, what we found over the years is what we really try to do is to that point of human-centered design and really bringing the communities in is that, you know, we as federal government, of course, have a sense of kind of what the national priorities are, what, you know, the administration's priorities are, but we're not on the ground either. And so what we established a few years ago was this roundtable that we host at the start of each kind of yearly process, which not only helps agencies, you know, set their priorities and their challenge statements, but brings NGOs and other folks in from the very start. Because what we sometimes see is that, you know, we might see the national challenge and the national picture, but the nuances get lost, or, you know, there might be, you know, some dynamics that we're just not considering. And so I think that really helps to alleviate some of that tension, which is to bring folks to the table from the very start at the problem definition phase and the question asking phase, and not just at the solution phase.
Mm. Thanks, Hannah.
Yeah, and I'd say, like, again, echoing some of Kalia's statements and Anna's statements, this is going to be a national survey. We're not trying to make this a 200 question survey. We'd like it to be pretty direct and pretty straightforward, and with the ultimately with the goal of keeping the lights on in terms of just getting a sense of the scale and diversity of the sector, but at the same time, the learnings that we can incorporate from this research is super important, but also just the other allied work that we can do with the industry and with direct seafood marketers in parallel to the survey, I think, is what's most important. And so to kind of answer Brett's question, yes, there potentially may not be harmony, but it doesn't mean that there's only one way that we could work in this space.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you all. Okay.
Maybe I can add another note here too, this idea of accessibility. So Sahir was just talking about, we're not making a 200 question survey. So, you know, what is going to be accessible? So I'll give a little bit of personal experience on this. I am an individual with, you know, what we refer to as lived experience. I have been and shared this with Lillian during our discussion ahead of this webinar, that I have been an individual that was a single mother, putting myself through college and using every public benefit available to me to be able to do that. So Section 8 housing vouchers, SNAP incentives, WIC, everything that you can think of. Those systems are incredibly difficult to navigate. The requirements around just filling out a SNAP application, for one thing. I was lucky enough that my mother worked for Department of Children and Families and had inside knowledge about how that system worked for me to be able to navigate the system. So the thing is, me being in this work just kind of came full circle because it was already inherent in my life. And how do we create more channels like that? Now, granted, I've gone through and gotten a lot of education and, even the access to that, that's an issue, because if we value lived experience so much, then what kind of on-ramps are we creating for people to equitably participate in this? Whether that is paying people or helping them to accomplish some other goals that they have that may not necessarily be in monetary form. Those are some of the other considerations we need to have for equitable participation in this system if we're trying to transform it or shift it.
I take that so much to heart. And it's a very active conversation happening, not only in our project, but in other spaces, the Colorado Food Systems Advisory Council. If we want to have folks with direct lived experience with nutrition assistance programs, how can we compensate and value their time in participating without jeopardizing their ability to access those benefits, which is maybe an obvious thing to say, but we don't have a good solution yet, right? I'm trying to read this question from Jason in the chat. Oh, it's talking about an opportunity to connect with speakers offline. Oh, so here, did you have something to share?
I was just going to mention that, yes, in terms of like lived experience, I feel like working in a community sport fishery as like distribution team. So literally like packing fish in a freezer, selling fish at farmers markets, has really influenced my understanding of this sector. At the same time, Joshua Stoll as well, he helped found a CSF during his grad school days, and he continues to own and operate an oyster farm as well. So it is again kind of practicing what we're preaching in terms of really being engaged in the system and then working with the system.
I tried to start an heirloom bean business in grad school. Let me tell you how that failed sometime over beers. Beans are unwieldy. So thank you. We have about 5 minutes left in our time together. 2 things I'll encourage. If you have questions for our panelists, put them in the chat. And if you have that question that we opened with, like what is a story or an impact that you'd love to be able to share from your sector that data might be able to help us to do, and especially based on your learnings here today. I'll look in the chat. Great. And resources, links, things put in the chat, we will collect into the webinar report out, and we'll make sure that so that way you can access them, those of you who participated today. While I wait to see if anything else comes in the chat, I will share this is part of an ongoing series. As you heard, next April, there we go. Thank you, Libby. April 8th at noon Eastern, 10 a.m. Mountain Time. I now live in an overlooked time zone, so I feel the need to rep my time zone set. Looking at a deeper dive into a very specific data set on the consumer and market trends, which is something I think we can all find interesting. Please follow the work of our amazing panelists. Let's if you want to, come off, put your video on, and we'll all collectively like give snaps, give some praise hands to them for their time and expertise, and welcome you all to visit our project page, get on our mailing list, which I think if you opted in when you registered for this webinar, you are on now to watch for updates, and support their great work. And let's also give you all, we support your great work. Thank you for joining us in this continued journey, and I'm just really thankful for this opportunity. Oh, thank you all for the kind words in the chat too. It's very kind.
Yeah, thank you all. This was a great conversation, co-panelists.
Thank you so much for having us. It was really great, and hope to connect with many of you on the line and hopefully collaborate in this sprint cycle.